The 25 Most Amazing Paintings by Frida Kahlo. Number 25. The Late Dismas, 1937. In this work, Frida Kahlo addresses a deeply rooted Mexican tradition, the post-mortem depiction of children, a common practice in the context of family mourning. The painting depicts the lifeless body of a child dressed in ceremonial attire, surrounded by flowers and religious symbols. This image, which could be disturbing in other contexts, is treated by Kahlo with an almost sacred reverence. The dead Dimas thus becomes a celebration of life rather than a manifestation of mourning. The work evokes Mexican cultural syncretism, where death is not a definitive farewell, but a transformation towards another form of existence. The technical precision with which Kahlo works with oil on canvas is evident in the meticulous representation of textile and floral details. The composition is balanced, with a masterful use of light that envelops the scene in a tenuous, almost spectral atmosphere. Each stroke demonstrates the artist's pictorial mastery, who manages to capture the texture of the skin with a chilling realism. Currently, the work is part of a private collection, although it has been exhibited in important retrospectives dedicated to Kahlo. Her influence is perceived in contemporary artists who explore mortuary iconography from a perspective that oscillates between the solemn and the poetic. The significance of El Difunto Dimas lies in its ability to redefine a funeral practice and endow it with a visual lyricism that transcends its original context. Kahlo manages to transform death into a subject of aesthetic and philosophical contemplation, introducing a perspective that is not only personal, but also collective. Its influence has resonated in contemporary art, where the exploration of the lifeless body has been taken up with new interpretations, imbued with the same sensitivity that the artist knew how to imprint on this unique piece. Number 24. Still Life, 1942. Within her pictorial production, Frida Kahlo dedicated several works to the genre of still life, a pictorial tradition with centuries of history that the artist reinterpreted through her particular symbolism. In this piece, Kahlo transcends the mere representation of inanimate objects to endow them with a disturbing and almost anthropomorphic presence. The arrangement of fruits and plant elements is not accidental. Each of them is arranged with a meticulousness that alludes to the fragility of existence and the inevitable decay of matter. It is not a conventional still life, but an exploration of time and mortality. Executed in oil on canvas, the work is distinguished by its chromatic density and richness of textures. Kahlo achieves a balance between the exuberance of the colors and the gravity of the subject, using precise brushstrokes that intensify the tactile sensation of the objects represented. The softly diffused light reinforces the melancholy that emanates from the composition. Exhibited at the Frida Kahlo Museum, the work has been the subject of multiple studies that link it to the Baroque tradition and to Surrealism, without completely pigeonholing it into either of these currents. Its influence has become evident in contemporary artists who reinterpret still life from an emotional and philosophical perspective, exploring its capacity to transmit the transience of life. Number 23. Girl with Death Mask, 1938. In this work, Frida Kahlo conjures up one of the most disturbing images in her repertoire, rooted in the Mexican worldview of life and death. The painting, executed during a period of intense pictorial experimentation, is part of a particularly prolific year for the artist, in which she explored childhood pain and the tensions between innocence and fatality. The protagonist, a girl wearing a school uniform, wears a skull mask, a symbol of the celebration of the Day of the Dead. This visual choice is not arbitrary. It alludes to the cyclical conception of existence and the familiarity with death from childhood in Mexican culture. Kahlo uses oil on masonite, giving the scene a vibrant texture and a palette that oscillates between the brightness of traditional colors and somber tones that reinforce the drama. The detailed and meticulous technique emphasizes the contrast between the softness of the child's skin and the rigidity of the mask, establishing a visual dialectic between the ephemeral and the eternal. This piece, which is now part of a private collection, has been exhibited in important retrospectives on the artist in museums in Europe and America. Its impact on later generations is undeniable, as it has served as an inspiration to contemporary creators who explore the duality between childhood and mortality in diverse sociocultural contexts. Number 22. Self-portrait with short hair. 1940. Following her separation from Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo embodies in this work an act of rupture and personal reaffirmation, deliberately distancing herself from the codes of femininity that had dominated her previous iconography. The artist is depicted with her hair recently cut, holding scissors in her hand and surrounded by scattered locks of hair, elements that symbolize detachment not only physically, but also emotionally. Her attire, a loose-fitting masculine suit, further accentuates the distance from the image with which Rivera immortalized her in his portraits. Here, Kahlo sheds the exuberance of her Tawano clothes and opts for a severe, almost androgynous appearance, in a gesture of emancipation. The work is done in oil on canvas and is refined in its execution, with a flat and neutral background that gives absolute prominence to the figure. The brushstrokes, precise and controlled, outline every detail with a sobriety that reinforces the emotional tension of the painting. The symbolism of the scene is reinforced by the inscription at the top, a verse from a popular song that alludes to loss and melancholy, establishing a relationship between the pain of love and renunciation. Currently, this work is part of the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where its presence has influenced feminist and performance artists who explore identity and transformation as essential elements of visual discourse. Number 21. Marxism will give health to the sick. 1954. In the last months of her life, Frida Kahlo channeled her ideological fervor into a work that moved away from her characteristic intimacy to adopt an openly political tone. In this painting, the artist is depicted standing, freed from her wheelchair, with a corset that opens in the center to make way for the symbols of Marxism. Karl Marx appears as a tutelary figure at the top, with a hand that descends in a redeeming gesture, while at the other end, the representatives of American imperialism are depicted with a threatening gesture. Kahlo not only proposes personal salvation through ideology, but also articulates a fierce critique of capitalism, which she holds responsible for the inequalities that afflict oppressed peoples. The technique used is oil on masonite, with a more variegated composition than in his previous self-portraits. Figures and symbols are superimposed in a structure that simultaneously suggests chaos and order, reflecting the political turmoil of the time. The chromatic palette is vibrant and dramatic, with contrasts that reinforce the emotional charge of the discourse. Each element is treated with an expressive detail that recalls his mature works, where symbolism reaches its maximum intensity. This painting, housed in the Frida Kahlo Museum in Mexico City, is one of the most eloquent in terms of the artist's ideological evolution and her commitment to social struggle. Its influence has transcended the pictorial realm, becoming a reference for political and artistic movements that have claimed its message as a declaration of resistance. Marxism, more than a theme, becomes here a redemptive force that Kahlo adopts in her visual imagery with the same passion with which she defended it in her life. Number 20. The Dream, the Bed. 1940. The work emerges during a period of intense introspection for Frida Kahlo, a time when her health was clearly beginning to deteriorate and when death loomed with disturbing proximity. The painter, always in dialogue with her own body, presents here an allegorical image of human fragility, using her bed as a space where reality and imagination merge. The bed, a recurring symbol in her work, becomes a dreamlike setting where the boundaries between life and death are blurred. In this piece, the artist evokes the constant threat of her own destiny, while exhibiting a macabre sense of humor and a lucid acceptance of the inevitable. Executed using oil on canvas, the painting is part of the surrealist tradition, although Kahlo, always reluctant to be classified, links it more to her intimate world than to any formal artistic movement. The richness of the details and the precision of the strokes demonstrate her technical virtuosity, while the composition, apparently chaotic, is carefully balanced to enhance the symbolic tension of the image. The figure of the artist lies in bed, accompanied by a skeleton decorated with vegetation, a metaphor for life blossoming within death. This duality, so present in the Mexican worldview, gives the work a deeply philosophical meaning. Currently, the painting is kept in a private collection, which has limited its public exhibition, although its impact has transcended borders and has inspired numerous interpretations in literature and film. Number 19. Frida and Diego Rivera, 1931. This double portrait was made shortly after Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera's wedding, capturing the complex dynamic between the two artists in an image that, beneath a serene appearance, hides multiple layers of meaning. Initially commissioned as a commemorative piece, the work became a testament to the relationship between the two, with Frida presented in a solemn and subservient attitude, while Rivera holds a palette and brushes, asserting his role as teacher and creator. The distance between their bodies, despite their hand in hand, foreshadows the tumultuous union that would define their lives. The oil on canvas stands out for its detail in the representation of the characters, especially in the faces, where Kahlo manages to capture the introspection in her own gaze and the imposing confidence of Rivera. The chromatic range is dominated by earthy and blue tones, evoking her husband's muralist palette. The composition is inspired by photographic portraits of the period, giving the scene a formal rigidity that contrasts with the deep emotional charge it conveys. In symbolic terms, the painting contains a subtle irony. Frida, although represented as the devoted wife, is the one who would end up consolidating an artistic legacy that transcended Rivera's shadow. Today, the piece is in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and its influence is evident in contemporary iconography, serving as a reference for numerous studies on identity and the role of women in art. Number 18. Memory, the Heart, 1937. This painting is one of the most visceral representations of the emotional pain that Frida Kahlo captured in her work, born from the suffering caused by Diego Rivera's betrayal of her sister Cristina. In a composition of great visual impact, the artist represents herself with an immense bleeding heart at her feet, an explicit symbol of the emotional devastation that consumes her. In her expression, however, there is no despair, but rather a melancholic, almost defiant resignation that reflects her ability to transform suffering into art. This work is a testament to her strength, a manifesto of her emotional independence despite her affliction. The piece is executed in oil on metal, an unconventional choice that Kahlo used in several of her smaller paintings. The metallic surface lends a unique luminosity to the colors, intensifying the drama of the scene. The image is dominated by the rigidity of the central figure, dressed in a school uniform, and the dismembered heart in the foreground, a clear allusion to the Christian iconography of the Sacred Heart, but reinterpreted with a brutally personal approach. The arrangement of the elements and the empty space surrounding the scene reinforce the feeling of isolation and loss. The work is currently part of the collection of the Dolores Olmedo Museum, where it has been the subject of numerous analyses due to its powerful symbolic charge and its relationship with the painter's biography. Its influence is undeniable in contemporary art, especially in artists who have addressed the theme of heartbreak and identity through powerful visual metaphors. The brutal honesty of this piece continues to resonate in the viewer, consolidating it as one of the purest expressions of pain turned into art. Number 17. The Truck, 1929. Conceived in a moment of deep introspection, the truck captures an everyday scene with an overwhelming symbolic charge. Frida Kahlo, still scarred by the accident that would change the course of her life, captures the image of a group of passengers on a tram, a composition that, far from being a mere observation of the environment, becomes a visual testimony of human fragility. The work, with its static perspective and subtle tension in the figures, allows us to glimpse the fate of its characters, as if time were frozen moments before an imminent event. Executed in oil on masonite, this painting reveals Kahlo's meticulous treatment of light and depth. Unlike her more surrealist works, a clear influence of Mexican folk art predominates here, with earthy colors and a defined line that emphasizes the individuality of each character. The structured, almost theatrical composition transforms the wagon into a kind of social microcosm. Exhibited in multiple private collections throughout the 20th century, the work has found a prominent place in retrospective exhibitions dedicated to the artist. Its impact has transcended the canvas, influencing cinema and literature that have explored tragedy and destiny as fundamental narrative elements. Number 16. Self-Portrait with Monkey, 1938. In Self-Portrait with Monkey, Frida Kahlo once again uses her image as a territory for exploring identity. The artist, with a fixed gaze and serene countenance, is placed at the center of the composition, accompanied by a monkey which, far from being a simple decorative element, acts as a symbol of loyalty and companionship in her personal universe. During this period, Kahlo developed her own iconography, in which animals represent aspects of her psyche, establishing a relationship of complicity between the human figure and nature. The technique used in this work denotes an almost miniaturist precision. The oil on canvas allows for a subtle gradation in the skin and hair, while the background, with a dense and enveloping texture, isolates the figure in an ethereal space, reinforcing the introspective character of the piece. This painting has been exhibited in prominent institutions, including the Dolores Olmedo Museum, where it shares the spotlight with other key pieces in Kahlo's repertoire. Beyond its relevance within the artist's work, this portrait has influenced later generations of creators who have approached the self-portrait as a tool of resistance and affirmation of identity. Number 15. The Wounded Table, 1940. Among Frida Kahlo's most enigmatic and monumental canvases, The Wounded Table stands as an allegory of pain and loss. Painted after her separation from Diego Rivera, this work encapsulates the artist's emotional devastation through an iconography deeply rooted in Mexican tradition. The table, arranged as an altar of sacrifice, brings together a series of characters that evoke autobiographical elements and cultural references, from pre-Hispanic figures to hybrid beings that defy classification. At the center, Kahlo is shown with a disturbing serenity, a witness to her own suffering. The monumentality of the piece, one of the largest in her production, highlights the importance that the artist gave to it. The oil-on-wood technique allows for a chromatic saturation that intensifies the dramatic charge of the scene. The meticulous arrangement of the elements, where each object and character seems loaded with meaning, recalls the structure of religious altarpieces, a recurring visual resource in her work. The painting was exhibited at the International Surrealism Exhibition in Mexico before mysteriously disappearing, becoming one of the most sought-after pieces in the history of modern art. The impact of La Mesa Herida has been unquestionable, inspiring visual artists, filmmakers and writers alike who have found in its symbolism a fertile field for reinterpretation. Its disappearance has only increased its mysticism, consolidating it as a fundamental work in the visual mythology of Frida Kahlo and in the narrative of contemporary art. Number 14. Roots. 1943. Created during a period of deep introspection, Roots is a testimony to the communion between the body and the earth, a visual exploration of fertility and the interdependence of living beings. The work emerges in a context where Frida Kahlo, suffering from health problems, poured her anguish and desire for plenitude into symbolic images. The painting, one of her most personal pieces, was conceived at a time when the artist was particularly influenced by European surrealism, although her pictorial language remained unmistakably Mexican. Executed in oil on metal, the painting exhibits meticulous attention to detail and a delicate texture that lends an almost sculptural quality to the figure's skin. The warm color palette contrasts with the earthy tones of the arid landscape surrounding the subject, whose body seems to merge with the earth through roots emerging from her torso. Charged with a disturbing visual poetics, the image symbolizes both life and the fragility of existence. Roots is currently part of a private collection, which has limited its access to the public and has contributed to its mysticism within Kahlo's legacy. Its aesthetic and symbolism have been taken up in numerous contemporary reinterpretations, evidencing its impact on artists seeking to explore the relationship between identity, nature, and the human body. Number 13. Self-portrait on the border between Mexico and the United States. 1932. During her stay in Detroit, Frida Kahlo experienced a constant tension between the industrialized culture of the United States and the symbolic richness of her Mexican roots. In Self-Portrait on the Border Between Mexico and the United States, this dichotomy becomes a visual statement in which the artist literally places herself between two worlds. The work emerges during a period of great personal transformation, marked by her estrangement from Diego Rivera and the perception of a country that, far from offering her inspiration, seemed cold and mechanized. Kahlo, with her pink dress and imperturbable expression, presents herself as a bridge between two antagonistic realities. The technique used is oil on metal sheet, a support that allowed for a meticulous finish and an intense chromatic vibration. The composition is divided into two contrasting halves. On the left, Mexico, represented with deep roots, pre-Hispanic symbols and lush vegetation. On the right, the United States, dominated by smoking factories and steel structures. The confrontation between the organic and the industrial not only responds to a political view, but also alludes to her feeling of displacement. Exhibited in various retrospective exhibitions of Kahlo, the painting has influenced generations of artists who explore the concept of border, both physical and identity-based, making it a reference point for Latin American art in the 20th century, inside and outside of Mexico. Number 12. Long Live Life. 1954. Painted in the last months of her life, Viva la Vida is a pictorial testimony that encapsulates the complexity of Frida Kahlo's spirit. The work, despite its apparent simplicity, condenses a contradictory vision, the celebration of existence in the face of the imminence of death. In a period where her health was rapidly deteriorating and her mobility was severely limited, Kahlo turned to the image of watermelons, a vibrant and juicy fruit, as a metaphor for vitality. The phrase that gives the work its title, inscribed on one of the fruits, is a final gesture of affirmation in the face of adversity. Executed in oil on masonite, the work is characterized by spontaneous brushwork and a palette dominated by intense reds, in contrast with greens and yellows. Unlike other paintings in which her figure occupies the center of the composition, here the focus is on the texture and symbolism of natural elements. The watermelon, associated in Mexican popular art with the Day of the Dead festival, reinforces the duality between the ephemeral and the eternal. Since its creation, Viva la Vida has been exhibited at the Casa Azul in Coyoacán, where much of the artist's legacy is preserved. Its presence in this space is fundamental, since it represents not only the culmination of her pictorial career, but also the materialization of her philosophy. Throughout the decades, the work has influenced creators who have explored color and symbolism in contemporary painting, consolidating itself as an iconic piece within Latin American art. Number 11. A Few Nips. 1935. Embodying the violence and fragility of the female body, Unos Muchos Paquetitos emerges in a context of personal pain for Frida Kahlo, in a turbulent Mexico where the harshness of everyday life is intertwined with artistic tradition. Inspired by a femicide documented in the press of the time, Kahlo transforms horror into a work of art that denounces impunity and sexist brutality. The scene, of visceral crudeness, transcends the criminal anecdote and is inscribed in a universal imaginary of suffering and oppression. Executed with the meticulousness of her characteristic stroke, the work uses oil on metal, a technique that evokes popular Mexican altarpieces. The composition is reminiscent of votive offerings, with a visual narrative that describes the event in all its crudeness. The meticulous brushwork reinforces the drama of the subject, while the background, of ambiguous neutrality, leaves the central figure suspended in a timeless space. Today, the piece is part of the collection of the Dolores Olmedo Museum in Mexico, where it is exhibited as a testament to Kahlo's realist crudeness. Her influence can be traced to later generations of artists who have explored gender violence with a similar intensity, incorporating her bold fusion of testimony and art into contemporary discourse. Number 10. The Embrace of Love of the Universe, the Earth, Mexico, Me, Diego and Mr. Chalut. 1949. This work, full of symbolism and philosophical depth, represents one of the most complex moments in Frida Kahlo's production, already immersed in an artistic maturity that exudes visual and conceptual synthesis. On the canvas, Kahlo places herself in an interconnected cosmos, where love and protection are manifested in layers of motherhood and divinity. The relationship with Diego Rivera is more than loving here. It is mythological, fusing the earthly with the divine. Señor Chalut, the guide dog of the dead in the Mexica cosmogony, reinforces the allusion to an imminent spiritual transition. The work, done in oil on masonite, shows Kahlo's technical mastery in her later years. Earthy colors blend with deep greens and skin tones, creating an organic effect that roots the scene in the fertility of the earth. The brushstrokes are firm, detailed in the textures of the skin and vegetation, evoking the iconography of pre-Hispanic goddesses and Renaissance Madonnas. Its location in the Dolores Olmedo Museum allows it to be appreciated alongside other key pieces from the artist's pictorial universe. Beyond its formal beauty, this work has been a reference for artistic movements and feminist discourses that have reinterpreted motherhood and love from a symbolic and political perspective. From conceptual art to contemporary muralism, The influence of this painting resonates in the exploration of human relationships with the earth, the body, and transcendence. Number 9. My Nanny and I, 1937. Childhood, memory, and identity converge in My Nanny and I, a work in which Frida Kahlo reinterprets her own childhood with the symbolic intensity that characterizes her work. Inspired by her experience as a mother, the artist evokes the time when she was breastfed by an indigenous wet nurse, situating the scene in a space of personal mythology where past and present dialogue in a visual language reminiscent of pre-Hispanic and surrealism. The wet nurse mother, with her face covered by a ritual mask, takes on an archetypal dimension, while little Frida, with her intense, adult gaze, transgresses childlike innocence. Painted in oil on metal, the painting once again evokes the tradition of Mexican votive offerings, where devotion and autobiographical narrative intertwine on a smooth, shiny surface. The precision of the strokes, the delicacy in the representation of the skin, and the depth of the dark backgrounds reinforce the symbolic charge of the scene. The symmetrical composition, with the body of the nurse holding the child on a vertical axis, refers to the sacred images of Christianity and the pre-Hispanic iconography of divine sustenance. Today, the work is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, where it is a key piece in the exploration of Mexican identity in 20th century painting. Beyond its value as a personal testimony, Mi Nana y Yo has been a reference in the artistic exploration of motherhood, mestizaje, and memory. From Chicano art to contemporary expressions of decolonial feminism, its influence resonates in creators who, like Kahlo, have turned introspection into a platform for social and political reflection. Number 8. Diego in My Thoughts, 1943. Painted during a period of deep introspection, Diego in My Thoughts emerges as a testimony to the devotion and torment that marked the relationship between Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. The work, conceived after a period of separation between the two artists, shows Kahlo wrapped in a Tijuana veil, a symbol of her Mexican identity and of the admiration she shared with Rivera for popular art. In the center of her forehead, Diego's face is not a simple portrait, but a manifestation of his constant presence in Frida's mind, reflecting the unbreakable bond that united them beyond suffering and distance. Executed in oil on masonite, this piece stands out for its meticulous brushwork and the emotional intensity it conveys through its details. Kahlo's meticulous technique, influenced by Mexican colonial tradition and the popular altarpiece, gives the work an almost mystical quality. The frontal composition and use of saturated colors generate an immediate impact, while the texture of the veil, treated with precision, reinforces the feeling of closure and resignation. Exhibited in multiple retrospectives throughout the 20th century, the work has been a benchmark of confessional art and has influenced generations of artists who explore the female psyche and emotional memory in contemporary painting. Number 7. What the Water Gave Me, 1938. In this complexly composed work, Frida Kahlo transforms the intimacy of her bath into an allegory of her life and memories. The scene, reflected on the surface of the water, unfolds a universe of figures that seem to emerge from the artist's subconscious, weaving together experiences of pain, pleasure, and death. More than a simple exploration of her biography, What the Water Gave Me represents a turning point in her career, where her personal imagery becomes even more surreal, challenging the boundaries between wakefulness and dreaming. Executed in oil on canvas, the painting is characterized by its narrative precision and mastery of inverted perspective. Kahlo uses an earthy and watery palette that reinforces the sensation of a world submerged in the psyche, while the delicate brushstrokes allow for the construction of scenes with the meticulousness of an altarpiece. The iconography, which includes mutilated bodies, roots, and fantastic beings, turns the bathtub into a stage where the artist narrates her story with unprecedented rawness. The piece has been exhibited in museums in America and Europe, and its influence extends to later artistic movements, where the female body is presented as a space of memory and transformation. Number 6. Without Hope. 1945. After a health crisis that left her bedridden, Frida Kahlo painted Hopeless as a reflection of desperation and submission to a body that became a prison. The painting was created in the context of convalescence, when the artist was forced to follow a high-calorie diet to regain weight, which transformed eating into an experience of anguish. The image shows her motionless on her bed, with a huge funnel introducing a grotesque feast of flesh, skulls, and inert beings into her throat, a crude representation of her impotence in the face of the medical prescriptions that invaded her privacy. The work, executed in oil on canvas, is notable for its vertical composition and the asymmetry generated by the presence of the funnel as a central axis. Kahlo employs her usual earthy palette and intense ochres to emphasize the oppression of the environment, while the elevated perspective intensifies the feeling of isolation. The meticulous brushwork lends a disturbing realism to the objects, which unfold with the precision of a still life. Exhibited on multiple occasions, the work has been an emblem of physical suffering as an artistic theme, influencing the contemporary representation of the sick body and its relationship to identity and resistance. Since its presentation in galleries and museums, Without Hope has inspired creators who explore the link between pain and image, establishing a dialogue between art and biography as vehicles of expression. The emotional intensity of the work resonates in the production of contemporary artists who seek to represent human vulnerability with the same honesty as Kahlo, ensuring that her legacy continues to redefine the boundaries of confessional painting. Number 5. Henry Ford Hospital. 1932. In the midst of a period of profound physical and emotional pain, Frida Kahlo painted Henry Ford Hospital, a work that bears witness to her suffering after a miscarriage in Detroit. The scene takes place on a floating bed in a desolate landscape, where the artist's body appears exposed in absolute vulnerability. This painting not only represents a personal memory, but also inaugurates a form of pictorial autobiography in which the female body is the territory of expression of loss and trauma. The iconography of the 6 red threads that connect Kahlo to various elements reinforces the idea of an unbreakable link between her physical experience and her psyche, turning pain into visual language. Painted in oil on metal, the work stands out for its meticulous precision and the meticulous definition of each object, a technique inspired by the Mexican votive offering tradition. The enameled texture of the support enhances the sharpness of the details, amplifying the crudeness of the scene. The combination of the dreamlike with the real generates a feeling of estrangement in the viewer, who is forced to confront the body as a space of suffering and resistance. This piece, now housed in the Dolores Olmedo Museum, has served as a point of reference for generations of artists who have explored the representation of trauma and female identity from an intimate and radically sincere perspective. Number 4. The Wounded Deer. 1946. With an economy of elements and a haunting emotional intensity, The Wounded Deer encapsulates the profound sense of doom that haunted Frida Kahlo throughout her life. The artist depicts herself with the head of a deer in the middle of a shadowy forest, her body pierced by multiple arrows. This hybrid of self and animal invokes both the pre-Hispanic tradition of the Nahual and the iconography of Christian martyrdom, establishing a dialogue between mythologies of resistance and sacrifice. The work emerges at a critical moment for Kahlo, who was facing the failure of a surgical intervention on her spine, and suggests resignation to a fate that, like the arrows that pierce her body, is inevitable and implacable. The oil on masonite reinforces the material vibration of the brushstroke, with a detailed treatment of the fur and a somber atmosphere that accentuates the tragic character of the scene. The carefully structured composition places the deer on a diagonal that guides the gaze along the path of the arrows, directing it towards a distant and empty horizon. Today, the painting is part of the collection of the Dolores Olmedo Museum, where it is the subject of constant analysis for its powerful symbolic charge and its influence on contemporary iconography. Artists from various disciplines have taken up its central motif to reflect on the fragility of the body and the persistence of the spirit in the face of suffering. Number 3. The Broken Column, 1944. This work, one of the most heartbreaking in Frida Kahlo's production, stands as a pictorial manifesto of suffering and resistance. In The Broken Column, the artist is shown facing forward, her torso open to reveal a fractured ionic column replacing her spine. Nails prick her bare skin, while tears run down her impassive face, testifying to the duality between extreme vulnerability and indomitable strength. The painting is the result of the immobility to which Kahlo was subjected after a failed operation on her spine, an experience that turned her own body into the epicenter of her work. This representation not only speaks of physical pain, but of loneliness and alienation, encapsulating her vision of existence as a continuous balance between resistance and breakdown. Executed in oil on masonite, the dense, worked surface creates an almost sculptural texture that emphasizes the physicality of pain. The composition is symmetrical and monumental, giving the figure an almost iconic presence, as if it were a martyred deity. The arid landscape that surrounds it reinforces the feeling of desolation, turning the background into an extension of its emotional state. The work is currently on display at the Dolores Olmedo Museum and has influenced multiple generations of artists who have approached the representation of the wounded body as an act of vindication and testimony. Its impact transcends painting, finding echoes in photography, performance, and sculpture, where the fragmented body becomes a symbol of resistance in the face of adversity. Number 2. Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, 1940. Painted during a period of intense introspection and emotional pain following her separation from Diego Rivera, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird falls within the tradition of Frida Kahlo's autobiographical painting. The work encapsulates the artist's emotional charge and identity, narrating her suffering and resilience through symbolic elements. In this portrait, Kahlo's hieratic expression contrasts with the natural environment that surrounds her, while the elements incorporated seem to bear the weight of her story. The hummingbird, a symbol of life and hope in pre-Hispanic tradition, appears inert, suggesting the loss or sacrifice of a love. Technically, the work is executed with oil on masonite fiber, a choice that gives it a compact and dense texture, favoring the meticulousness of the detail. Kahlo's meticulous brushstrokes demonstrate her mastery in the representation of skin, hair, and the natural elements that surround her, evoking the precision of 15th-century Flemish painting, but with a symbolic charge typical of the Mexican tradition. The color palette is vibrant but restrained, dominated by deep greens and earthy tones that reinforce the sensation of disturbed harmony. Exhibited at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, the painting has served as inspiration for generations of artists who seek in personal iconography a way to emotional testimony. Its influence is evident in contemporary art, where autobiographical symbolism and the aesthetics of nature as a metaphor for suffering have gained strength. Number 1. The Two Fridas. 1939. Frida Kahlo painted the two Fridas at a time of profound emotional crisis, shortly after her divorce from Diego Rivera. The work represents a disturbing duality. Two versions of the artist sitting together, holding hands, but with fundamental differences in their clothing and their connection to blood. This duplicity has been interpreted as the internal struggle between the Frida of European roots and the mestiza Frida, or as a representation of the emotional tear after the breakup. The presence of the exposed heart and the flow of blood refer to a medical iconography that is intertwined with the emotional wound, a recurring feature in Kahlo's work. Executed in oil on canvas in a monumental format, the composition stands out for its symmetrical balance, although the drama of the blood flow introduces a tension that prevents any sense of stability. The meticulousness of the anatomical details and the texture of the tissues reveal the technical skill of the artist, whose stroke, despite its apparent naivety, possesses surgical precision. The work is exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, where it has been a key piece in the revaluation of 20th-century Mexican art, becoming an icon of feminist art and post-colonial identity. The powerful symbolic charge of Las Dos Fridas has resonated in different artistic disciplines, from photography to cinema, where the fragmentation of the self and the exploration of female identity have found a source of inspiration. Its impact goes beyond visual art. It has influenced the discourse on cultural duality and emotional distress in contemporary literature and thought. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.